Did witches really exist? Why were witches harassed and oppressed? Were witches men or women? Before we tackle the Massachusetts Salem Witch Trials that took place in 1692, let's look back at the European history behind witch hunts, persecutions, and burnings with Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast.
Writers such as Sir Walter Scott and Thomas Hardy thought of witches as romantic rebels, and I mean romantic in the post-Enlightenment romance era sense of the word, or they were outlaws, and both writers described solitary rural witches and cunning women in their novels. French writer Jules Michelet, an anti-monarchist and anti-Catholic, produced many books of social reform in history. He advocated a turn from Christianity to worshiping a great mother goddess and held that women were morally superior to men and that witch trials were an effort by the elite to subvert the rights of women and the working class. He declared in his 1862 book, La Sorcellerie, that medieval witchcraft had been an egalitarian rural religion led by female priestesses. Even if these witches had worshipped Satan, they did not celebrate him as a prince of darkness, but rather he represented a god of fertility and a patron deity of those condemned by royals and their henchmen. But Michelet based his ideas a lot more on conjecture and political theory than he did on historical research. But later generations of writers and unconventional academics ran with this narrative. 19th century writers such as Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud produced the idea of a universal ancient matriarchy in which there had been once widespread goddess worship, but this universal matriarchy was destroyed by the Greco-Roman pantheon of Zeus and his ilk. These thinkers incorporated the ideas of ancient matriarchy into their theories of communism and psychoanalysis. Early women's rights activists, such as Matilda Jocelyn Gage, published her own version of the anti-clerical witch trials in 1893 called Women, Church, and State. She based her accounts on Michelet and claimed that upward of 9 million women were burned at the stake during what she called the burning times. This figure was repeated by other Victorian authors who thought of the Middle Ages as nothing more than an embarrassing setback for Western civilization between classical antiquity and the Renaissance. But relying on hearsay or wild estimates for the death toll of witch trials is unnecessary because witch trials were meticulously recorded. If we have any good records from the Middle Ages or early modern period, it's church records or Inquisition records, and the church thought that witch trials were its domain. Based on reliable accounts and compilations from historians such as Brian Vivek and others, the total for everyone executed in the witch craze from the late 14th through the 18th century across almost 400 years were around 45,000, and those persecuted about 90,000. And that's a terribly high amount of deaths for executions based on little more than mob justice. But it's not 9 million people. And most of those deaths can be attributed to religious animosity in the wake of the Reformation, rather than paranoia over the supernatural. Another theory about those convicted of witchcraft is that many of these women were midwives, and that midwives were targeted for witch burnings as a means for men to oppress women and dominate the practice of medicine, even in the realm of childbirth. This idea is also connected to the Salem Witch Trials, the idea that midwives and healers were accused. This has actually been analyzed closely, and what researchers found is that one was less likely to be accused of witchcraft if they were a midwife, and midwives were actually more likely to be one of the accusers, because one of the things that people were accused of, they were accused of being a witch, was causing babies to die and causing women to die in childbirth. Quite often, midwives were called in as expert witnesses, and they would confirm that they saw a woman causing women to die. Another counterintuitive fact concerning witch trials is that they weren't all women. Pockets of Europe saw persecution where the victims were almost exclusively women, but across Europe, 20% of the victims were men. In some parts of Europe, it was mainly men. In Finland, for example, usually only men were accused of witchcraft, since dark magic was associated with warlocks and sorcery and higher education, a decidedly male profession. Furthermore, not everyone who was declared guilty by church authorities for practicing witchcraft was violently executed. As we've seen, there were gradations of practicing magic. Using a charm to heal a neighbor was far less of an offense than invoking demons to cause a flood or poison a well. Many of those declared guilty of lesser forms of witchcraft were able to live freely, but still under scrutiny. It was only when the devil got involved that capital punishment entered the discussion. So the widely accepted belief that witches were free thinkers who didn't know their place in the rigid medieval hierarchy, or they were oppressed pagans, is a modern-day reinvention of the past, and it's not based on historical record. Although quite a few of those accused of being witches likely did have unorthodox ideas that at least mirrors those found in pagan and pre-Christian religions, that's about as far of a connection as we can stretch. Now, the classic example of the witch burning craze is the events that took place in late 17th century Salem, Massachusetts, the site of the infamous Salem witch hunts. But even this event, which took place in a literal puritanical culture, can't only be explained by social paranoia or the oppression of women. Origin of these events was not the issue of witchcraft, but issues of land disputes and an initial challenge to the theocratic rule of puritanical society. But it soon spiraled out of control into a series of hearings and prosecutions of witchcraft, resulting in the executions of 20 people, mostly women. The reason for this, once again, was not due to overwhelming belief in the supernatural. Rather, it was the end result of a series of petty vendettas between people who didn't have an emotional outlet and looked for draconian means to settle this feud. This event is remembered due to such 19th century works as George Bancroft's History of the United States, which condemn Puritan superstition and use the event as a cautionary tale of the struggle between science and religion, even though the Salem Witch Trials are direct evidence that secular courts were more likely to execute accused women than religious courts. And then Arthur Miller's 1950s play The Crucible, which used the science versus religion tack to describe the Salem Witch Trials, isn't even really about the history of the events themselves, but it's a thinly veiled allegory of McCarthyism in Cold War America. But this play is how a lot of people understand the actual history of this time.
One person's hallucination can be easily dismissed, but what happens when an entire crowd has the same hallucination or suffers from the same mental illness? It's enough to make somebody believe in magic and pick up their pitchfork ready to hang an accused witch. Now, such mass delusions have led to witch hunts in the past. You look at some of the most notorious historical cases of mass hysteria and moral panics, but these cases don't only extend to Puritan-style witch hunts.
In the year 1374, a very strange event happened in dozens of medieval towns along the Rhine River Valley, and it was described by dozens of physicians, chroniclers, monks, priests, and even municipal orders trying to stop this event that was described by authorities. Hundreds of people suddenly got the compulsion to dance. They scarcely paused to eat or rest and danced for hours or even days on end. Within weeks, the dancing mania engulfed large areas of northeastern France and the Netherlands, and it only stopped after several months. The same event happened again in the city of Strasbourg in 1518. About 400 men, women, and children participated, and there were dozens of people who died, whether due to exhaustion or dehydration. In between these two dancing events, another strange event happened in the Spanish Netherlands in a nunnery. This happened in 1491 as cases for trials of witchcraft began to increase, and several nuns were declared possessed, which caused them to race around like dogs, jump out of trees, pretending to be birds, or meow and claw their way up tree trunks like cats. According to the records we have of this period, other people behaved like this, but it was nuns who were disproportionately affected. And over the next 200 years, in nunneries all over Western Europe, hundreds were plunged into states of delirium, where they screamed and convulsed and confessed to having carnal relations with devils. We have all these documents that attest to these things happening, including trial documents in the archives of Inquisition records, or church trials for heresy. We have copious in-depth accounts and testimonies of nuns doing some very strange things. So what was going on here? What caused dozens of people, or even hundreds of people, to dance nonstop for weeks or months on end, to act like animals, and to claim possession? There's been all sorts of suggestions for why these things happened. In the early centuries, at the end of the Middle Ages or the beginning of the Renaissance, the easiest explanation was actually some form of possession. But even at the time, there were contemporary observers who thought that there was some sort of sickness. They could have been divinely afflicted, but it could have been a natural affliction as well, a sort of garden variety madness. In more recent decades, many have turned to a biological explanation. Maybe they ingested a mold containing psychotropic chemicals that caused them to hallucinate. But more recently, scholars have turned to the field of psychology and anthropology to argue that the dancing plagues and possession epidemics were classic instances of mass psychogenic illness, or crowd psychology. What is the lure of mass delusions? What's a psychological explanation for why we see these events show up so much, not just in history, but continually in the modern era? Collective delusions have a powerful seductive lure that change in a chameleon-like fashion to confirm our deepest fears or realize our greatest desires. Modern-day fears of satanic cults resemble the persecution of various deviants during medieval European witch hunts.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.